So now let's go to authorship, because this is actually another one of my big little personal things that I came to that I think is a unique contribution as well. Regarding the plural authorship of First Clement, I discussed this a little bit in my Clement stream, but now I'm actually going to go into more detail on the case for that on over here. So ironically, the Clement stream has a little bit less on this than I have on here, even though this is not specifically focused on Clement. And I'm focusing on a lot now because because I did receive some objections to this, mainly from Swan Sonna, particularly when I asked it of him in his stream. I think it was his case for the monepiscopacy stream on reason and theology. I gave this objection to say on it, and he gave another example. I'll raise it up later. Point being, I have a good interest in establishing the authorship of Clement and demonstrating that the evidence shows that it was of plural authorship, because I believe that has some big implications. So, authorship is commonly assumed to be Clement of Rome, and this is half true. I believe the evidence can establish that half. But the letter itself and the two earliest authorial attestations very likely refer to collective authorship of the Roman ecclesial leaders. So, first thing to look at is the prologue of the letter itself. So, it first says, the church of God that sojourns in Rome, to the church of God that sojourns in Corinth. And again, sorry if it's blue, if people can't really see it well, but the blue does say, to the church of God that sojourns in Corinth. And I linked them up with the relevant Greek. So, the he ecclesia tou theo he paroikousa Romain, so the church of God, the resider in Rome, and then te ecclesiae tou theou te paroikouse Corinthon, so the church of God that resides in Corinth. Now, so what? Why is this important? Because this is a standard epistolary opening where the recipient names himself, and then the author names himself, and then he names the recipient, and particular with the dative sense to literally say this guy to this guy. And you can see this a lot in Paul's own letters, for example, ubiquitously, and in many other ecclesial letters throughout church history and non-Christian letters as well. This is a very standard opening. The author names himself and then names the recipient immediately after with the dative tense in order to say to this person. So this is important because what this shows is that the letter explicitly states its authorship as the church in Rome. Get the gears spinning in your head. I think you can see where I'm going with this. So, to further demonstrate this is that we can look at the nature of the recipient by looking at how they're described in the letter. So the recipient is equivalent. The recipient is equivalent strongly with the author themselves. So the church at Rome, the church at Corinth. There's a conceptual distinction, just two different instances: one church in Corinth, one church in Rome. And so it can be helpful to establish who they meant specifically as the church in Corinth. And so the letter explicitly addresses numerous individuals at Corinth, chiefly those involved in the schism. So it says, they say in chapter 52:1, the master, brothers, and that's an address, O brothers, has no need of anything. So adelphoi. And then in 53, next chapter, 53 verse 1, for you know, epistaste, a plural second person verb, you know well the sacred scriptures, dear friends, agapetoi, beloved, plural. And then in chapter 54 verse 1, this is very interesting. Now then, who, this, singular, among you, and humin, plural, is noble. And then you, humis, plural, therefore, who laid the foundation of the revolt, must submit to the presbyters and accept discipline leading to repentance, bending the knees of your heart. So this combined with, which was my main thing that I sent to Swan Sonna, which he objected to. So this combined with the ubiquitous use, the absolute use of the first person plural by the authors throughout First Clement, and then combined with the literal authorship of the church in Rome, this therefore almost certainly refers to the collective leadership of the city as the authors of this. It's very, very clear, very, very obvious now that we see this evidence. So it's three things combined. The fact that the church in Corinth is a plurality of individuals. The fact that the authors explicitly use the first person plural every time throughout the letter, and that the author is given as the church in Rome, not Clement, not Bob, but the church at Rome. Now, now we look at the two earliest authorial attestations of the letter. So it's very likely confirmed, the plural authorship, very likely confirmed by these two earliest attestations. So the first one I want to look at is Irenaeus in his Against Heresies, book 3, chapter 3. He says, in the time of this Clement, no small dissension having occurred among the brethren at Corinth, the church in Rome dispatched a most powerful letter to the Corinthians. Notice that. He mentions Clement. At the time of this Clement, the church at Rome dispatched a letter to the Corinthians. Now, this is important. So clearly, if Irenaeus wanted to say Clement is the author, properly speaking, of the letter, he could very easily, he should. This is one of the few areas where you can give a would that makes sense. I say that he would say, in the time of this Clement, he dispatched the most powerful letter to Corinthians. But he doesn't. Irenaeus switches the subject entirely to the church in Rome, and that they dispatched a most powerful letter to the Corinthians. And now, of course, the church, it's a collective singular noun. But point being, he does a different subject altogether. And contextually, this would be in reference to plural, multiple leaders who dispatched this. So yeah, and it seems quite likely that Irenaeus may simply just be going off the letter itself. He recognized that the letter is names its author as the church in Rome, and that this is distinct from Clement. But Irenaeus highlights that this is in the time of Clement. And so it's clear, Irenaeus does seem to assume that the church as a collective dispatched the letter of the Romans to the Corinthians. Now, the second attestation, not very well known, is from Dionysius of Corinth in the late 2nd century, around the same time as, actually either slightly before or at the same time as Irenaeus. And this is a fragment preserved in Eusebius's Ecclesiastical History, book 4, chapter 23. But I'm using this because it's a fragment of a 2nd century source. So I will occasionally use Eusebius because he preserves sources from the time period that I'm restricting myself to. And so Dionysius of Corinth, he says so Eusebius says this is a letter dispatched to the church of Rome to Soter specifically. But here's what the letter itself actually says in a fragment he preserves. So Dionysius says, today we have passed the Lord's holy day in which we have read your humon, plural, epistle. From it, whenever we read it, we shall always be able to draw advice, as also from the former epistle, which was written to us through Clement. So, obviously, the Church of Rome, they dispatched a certain letter later on to the Corinthians, but then they're likening it, they're reading it regularly and likening it to another letter written before through Clement. Notice this attestation isn't as strong, but it does give a good hint. It's not saying that this is from Clement, this letter, but written to us through Clement. Clement is instrumental. And I forgot to fix the slide for this because I made an error. I thought that the your letter, humon letter, was the same one as the letter written through Clement, but actually when you read here, it does say, from it, whenever we read it, we shall always be able to draw advice, as also from the former epistle, which was written to us through Clement. So there's actually two distinct letters here. But nonetheless, this actually does show that the collective Roman authorship sent letters twice. So first Clement, and then another later letter to the church at Corinth, which is explicitly said by Dionysius to be of you, plural, humon. But the former letter was written to us through Clement. And so not as explicit. One could potentially simply say, well, by through Clement, Dionysius did mean it was actually authored properly by Clement. Possible, but it makes better sense in terms of why he specifically used dia Clementos, which is through. It's quite an instrumental preposition, that it was written to us through Clement. And it makes better sense that Dionysius assumes what Irenaeus assumes, and likewise sees what's in the letter itself, that it was written by the collective church. And so we have another second, not as crazy strong, but otherwise a second authorial attestation to the plural collective authorship of First Clement. But yeah, again, I forgot to change the slide because there's two different letters mentioned here, not the same one. But nonetheless, it is evidence for the plural authorship of First Clement as well. So I will say this nonetheless. So through Clement makes sense as either some kind of scribe or a foreign correspondent, main representative, or perhaps both. So these attestations, the evidence from the letter itself, the witness of Irenaeus and the witness of Dionysius, makes perfect sense to see Clement not as the author, properly speaking, but as the scribe and or a foreign correspondent. Now, so given this evidence, again, what do? Get rid of prior presuppositions, looking at the evidence diachronically from the earliest to the latest, we clearly see that with the earliest evidence from both First Clement itself and its earliest witnesses, that it was very, very, very likely of plural authorship. Now, there's some objections to this, because as I said, I sent these objections to Swansona in a Q&A of his stream on Reason and Theology for their case for the monepiscopacy. I sent this objection to Swansona, and he gave a significant objection to it. He says that we cannot rule out the use of a royal we. So that is an individual author using the first person plural in representation of a collective. So there's still fundamentally one author, but they represent a collective. They emphasize their royal greater power. But nonetheless, they're still a single author. And the key example of this that Swan brings up, and it's a smart one because Roman Catholics would traditionally consider First Clement as like the first papal encyclical, maybe apart from First and Second Peter. But either way, whatchamacallit. So they'll consider that, and so they do consider, Swan does consider Clement as like the author proper. So then he raises another example of a papal encyclical, Munificentissimus Deus, which dogmatized the Assumption of Mary, and that encyclical exclusively uses the first person plural, and yet there's clearly a singular author, Pope Pius XII. Whatchamacallit? Okay. Hey, Liam Pender, good to see you, buddy. Good to see you. Clement had no authority. His position does. That's semantics, okay? When we're saying that this person had authority, we are obviously meaning in the context of their office. This is semantics. If he addressed the letter as from Clement, it would be a personal letter, but addressing it from the Church of Rome means Clement speaking for the church. Not true, as I'll demonstrate just here. Well, for one, there's multiple episcopal letters in official capacity that are addressed in that mention the single author themselves. I'm not simply saying, oh, me, and all that stuff, but just simply mentioning, hey, this is who it's from, me, the author, singular. So, no, this is importing later categories in. I'm going to demonstrate more on this why. Anyway, so my first response is that the first person plural ought by default be considered actual unless the context determines otherwise. The royal we is not common and is an exceptional literary type of use of we. And as I've seen, no primary source evidence prefers or implies a singular author, notwithstanding a scribe or correspondent within the letter or the two earliest attestations of authorship. Again, best evidence would be through Clement. The letter is sent through Clement, but that doesn't even necessarily or even prefer a single author in the sense of who composed what was put into the letter. It's very easily read as Clement as an instrument of the letter, whether by being a scribe or a foreign, a foreign dignitary, or both. Anyway, so response number 2, not just use of the first person plural, but the direct naming of the author, as in the church in Rome, which combined with we and the address to the church in Corinth clearly being multiple persons, requires us to take the Church of Rome as the collective leadership. Okay, Liam, you're making a distinction between the church of a whole and the leader of the church, which people in the first century never would have made. Well, yes, they would. In terms of just a basic conceptual distinction, there's the church, the whole church, and then there's an individual, even granting their office, the person. I'm not trying to draw a hard distinction between the leader, the representative, and the church themselves. I recognize, obviously, there is strong conceptual overlap, even in terms of representation. It can maybe said, especially primarily in monepiscopal contexts, that the bishop is the church in this sense. But again, you're importing these categories, not me. I'm simply looking at the evidence as it is. And the evidence as it is suggests a plural authorship. It makes sense of what's in the letter. You have to assume a monepiscopal model, read that into this text in order to make this distinction. My position is simpler, makes better account of the evidence. That's all I'm saying here. And this is going to be further evidence later on the idea of, oh, well, they're one guy being the church, so therefore the church here could simply be the singular guy. As I'll show the later evidence, it's very clear that Rome's supreme leadership was plural. But yes, anyway, so that, so here's the thing. So not just that the first person plural is used, the we, because that was the main thing that Swanson objected to, that I just appealed to the use of we, and that's all he responded to. But in my question, I explicitly also appealed to the fact that the author of the letter is the Church of Rome. And that's what I key appeal to, because the normative way of these letters sent by episcopal leaders, even in the capacity of representation, is by addressing themselves. I'm sending this to you or you guys. Point being, it does become the norm in monepiscopal contexts for letters to say, hey, it's this guy, this bishop guy to these guys here. Or in some other way, it's clear that there was a single guy behind the letter. But point being, we see in the very prologue, the very opening of First Clement, that's the Church of Rome to the Church of Corinth. And again, there's something else you missed out, Liam. As I mentioned in the other part of the stream, the church in Corinth is clearly intended as multiple individuals, as from the letter itself. And so that, combined with the equivalent title, the church in Rome, combined with the use in we, prefers us, therefore, to assume that there's multiple authors behind this. If you want to argue that there was one principal author, but he acted in these other specific monepiscopal conceptions of the bishop as being the true representative of the whole church and speaking on behalf of the whole church, you can do that, but that's not from the evidence. You have to import those foreign categories. Anyway, I hope that's the biggest distraction I have now. Not that you're a distraction, Liam. Those are good responses, but I think they miss out on a few things. And the final response, the most key response to Swan's criticism, is that Munificentissimus Deus names Pope Pius XII as the singular author, not the church that sojourns in Rome. So that alone just annihilates the comparison right there. Sure, the royal we is used in Munificentissimus Deus. That's great. If that's all I was appealing to in Clement, then and otherwise the letter said from Clement to the church at Corinth or to this and that and all that stuff, granted, that would be a stretch. That'd be an assumption. But it's not, because I'm using the plural we and the fact that it's the church at Rome and the fact that the church at Corinth is clearly numerous individuals in order to say that there is a plural authorship behind the letters. And by the way, this isn't me saying that therefore there was no highest leader who could in some context be said to represent the church of Rome. That's not what I'm saying at all, because an archiepiscopal model could very much mean that. I'm simply saying that those behind the letter, there was clearly more than one person behind the letter. That's all I'm saying. It's actually very modest, but I think combined with other evidence does cause questions against the monepiscopacy. That's my response to Swan. Hope he gets it. So what this demonstrates, given that there were numerous leaders behind the authorship of First Clement, this demonstrates that Rome's leadership at the time was fundamentally collegial in nature, particularly in interactions, specifically here in interactions with foreign jurisdictions, which is very important because that would eventually primarily become the role of the monepiscopal bishop, particularly, for example, in the context of ecumenical councils. For example, the bishop plus maybe a couple of priests, acolytes, and all that would attend the council and represent their church there. Or in, again, ecclesial controversies, it'd be this bishop sends a letter to this bishop sends a letter to that bishop. But here we have the plural leadership of Rome addressing a controversy in Corinth, but collectively, not simply one dude, but their collective leadership pulls in their takes, their decisions, what they want to say into a letter to another city. Very significant, very, very significant, especially if you want to assert that that the Clement demonstrates Roman supremacy because they're weighing in on something in a foreign city. That would kind of backfire. But anyway. Thank you, Josh. Thank you very much. Scholarly consensus is First Clement had one. Most scholarly consensus. Most scholars